This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by NordVPN. When you use my link, you'll get a huge discount on a 2-year plan, plus 4 additional bonus months.
The term Luddite is generally used to refer to people who oppose technological change and innovation, from automobiles to computers. In 2015, Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk were included in the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's Luddite Awards for spreading what the foundation called alarmism about artificial intelligence. The term is generally intended to be derogatory, referring to people who oppose changes and innovation merely out of fear or ignorance or pure stubbornness. But the term Luddite actually has a specific historic meaning. The modern use of the term doesn't really capture the philosophy and motivations of the actual Luddites, people who became famous in the 19th century for smashing looms. It's history that deserves to be remembered.
The last quarter of the 18th century was a period of incredible technological growth, and England was a center for innovation. According to Roman Stollinger in the Luddite Rebellion, Past and Present, by 1800 England had the largest per capita income in all Europe. This is when James Watt built his first steam engine and Richard Arkwright built his first spinning frame, a water-powered device that spun yarn. Edmund Cartwright patented his power loom in 1785, and while not commercially successful, it was the basis for mechanical weaving. For the first time, large parts of weaving and textile creation were being automated, and throughout England, the entire industry was changing. The first weaving factory, in a modern sense, according to Brian Bailey in his book The Luddite Rebellion, was a silk spinning mill at Derby. The advancements were many and significant, but brought with them some of the greatest social upheavals in English history. Rural workers moved in droves to towns and cities, taxing the ability of society to adjust. Overcrowding, disease from poor sanitation, slums, and poverty all contributed to instability and discontent. In 1723, the Black Act was passed, popularly known as the Bloody Code. By the end of the 18th century, there were over 200 capital crimes, many of them crimes against property. Those acts were used broadly and often without mercy. In 1801, a 13-year-old was hanged for stealing a spoon. In 1810, reformers tried to pass a law that would abolish the death penalty for thefts under the value of 5 shillings. Lord Ellenborough, the Lord Chief Justice, decried the bill, claiming if it passed, no man could leave his shop for an hour out of doors without the most alarming apprehensions. In 1799 and 1800, the Parliament passed the Combination Acts, which reinforced laws banning trade unions. Growing gaps between rich and poor and government action against the working class was exacerbated by the Napoleonic War's economic impact. Napoleon's continental system strangled trade to mainland Europe, and in 1810 the United States passed the Non-Intercourse Act. The value of British trade to the United States dropped by more than 80% the following year. Woolen and cotton manufacturers were devastated. According to Bailey, in the West Riding of Yorkshire alone, more than 1,000 manufacturers went out of business. On top of all of that, disastrous harvests and other economic stress led to soaring prices for bread. Knitted goods had become big business for England in the 18th century, but it was almost entirely a cottage industry, carried on largely by women and children. Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, wrote that in Richmondshire and North Allertonshire you see all the people, great and small, a-knitting. Woolen stockings were especially in demand. Reverend William Lee invented the stocking frame in 1589. According to legend, he did it to give a woman he was courting more time to pay attention to him. The frame was eventually widely adopted, but was still used at homes by cottage knitters. Leicester hosier William Gardner said that these lower orders who did the knitting were comparatively in a state of ease and plenty, most importantly because they had leisure. But that rapidly changed at the end of the 18th century. It became rare for the stockingers to own their own frames, and the knitters had to pay for seamers and buy oil for their own rented machines. Middlemen and frame renters squeezed the profits, and workers lost their leisure time, instead working for a pittance for 14 hours a day. Seeking more money, children were made to operate looms. In 1778, government committees were told of pauper children enslaved to long hours of work, toiling from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. day after day for a pittance. The destruction of machines as a means of protest was not new. In 1675, weavers in London, protesting that looms could do the work of many men and therefore threaten them with poverty, burned looms in the street. In 1776, a most riotous and outrageous mob destroyed the machines at Arkwright's factory. 3 years later, knitters destroyed machines in Nottingham when petitions for a minimum wage and protection of the art and mystery of framework knitting failed. In 1802, a letter demanded a manufacturer pull down his shearing machines, or they would pull them down for, "We will, you damned infernal dog." By early 1811, the situation was critical. Thousands were out of work and in abject poverty with little possible relief. While their motivations are often presented as anti-technology, the technology weavers attacked wasn't especially new. As Bailey says, their real grievance was the use of wide frames for making cheap merchandise and the undermining of skilled workmen's livelihoods. The technology was merely a convenient symbol, an effective economic target. They focused their attacks on looms and manufacturers who are using the looms in a fraudulent and deceitful manner to undercut costs with cheap, low-quality goods. I don't know if it's obvious, but Pocky is a Luddite. Seriously, he is constantly disrupting and doing his best to break machines that he sees as a threat to his livelihood. Whether it's strolling across the keyboard or knocking over equipment, Pocky is always willing to resort to violence in order to draw attention to his cause. But even worse, Pocky never uses a VPN, which is one reason that I'm so grateful for today's sponsor, NordVPN. He seems to completely disregard that pirates might be spying on his browsing history. If anyone can benefit from NordVPN's strict no-logs policy, it's this sketchy troublemaker. And he seems to have no idea that by using NordVPN's thousands of servers around the world, he could have access to streaming content without annoying geographic limitations. Luckily, I've been using NordVPN for years. It even has a kill switch, so if Pocky manages to disconnect the VPN, my data is never at risk. And in a Pocky household, I never know when I might need that handy 24/7 tech support. What's more, one account allows me to connect to up to 10 devices, including one-click next-generation encryption for mobile, so I can protect myself even when Pocky is walking on my phone or tablet. And all that comes with a no-risk, 30-day money-back guarantee.
So don't be a Luddite when it comes to your browser. Your history deserves to be remembered, but your internet history deserves to be your own. Get a huge discount on a 2-year plan and an additional 4 months when you use my link at nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy, or use the link in the description.
The opening of what became the Luddite Rebellion began in the town of Arnold in Nottinghamshire, when knitters removed jackwires from frames being used to make cut-ups, cheap stockings cut from framed cloth, in early 1811. More instances occurred in February and March. On March 11th, a huge crowd gathered in Nottingham to protest hosiery masters who were reducing wages. The militia dispersed the crowd, but that night a mob attacked frame owners and destroyed more than 60 frames. Even as dragoons were called out to restore order, hundreds of frames were destroyed in the following weeks. Despite reward offers, no arrests could be made. The rebels took their name from a legendary figure described in several 1811 publications. According to an article in the Nottingham Review from December 20th, 1811, Ned Ludd was an inhabitant of Ansty, near Leicester, where he apprenticed to learn the art of framework knitting. Ned was averse to the confinement of the frame, and so his master reported him to the magistrate, who whipped the boy as a remedy for Ned's disorder. Ned in turn smashed the frame, which he considered as the occasion of his punishment. Another version, published in the 1811 History of Nottingham, says that an ignorant youth named Ludland was ordered to square his needles, and in his ignorance took a hammer and beat them to a heap. Both stories claim that the youth was then the inspiration for the fictional leader of the movement, a General, Captain, or King Ludd. Bailey suggests that these stories, both biased accounts, may not be the real origin of the name, instead pointing to the possibly legendary King Ludd, who supposedly built the Ludd Gate in London in 66 BC. He was a better namesake than the village idiot the 1811 sources describe. The summer was relatively quiet, but on November 10th, a large mob gathered at Bulwell Forest and, led by Ned Ludd, attacked hosier Edward Hollingsworth's property. Hollingsworth and his men shot at the rioters, killing John Wesley dead. The rioters forced their way in and destroyed his frames. The outbreak spread quickly throughout the Midlands. The Lord Lieutenant of Nottinghamshire, Henry Pelham Clinton, told the Home Secretary on November 16th that the riots were of local and partial nature, totally unmixed as yet with any political notion, and exacerbated by high corn prices. Prince Regent George, ruling in the place of his mentally unstable father George III, saw the disturbances as a serious threat and offered £60 sterling for information leading to the convictions of machine breakers. A declaration to our well-beloved brother and Captain-in-Chief Edward Ludd by the general agitators accused a lace manufacturer of using cheap, bad lace to make £15,000, whereby he had ruined the cotton lace trade and consequently our worthy and well-beloved brethren. It accused Charles Lacy of the most diabolical motives, namely to gain riches by the misery of his fellow creatures. It demanded Lacy disperse the money to the workmen, or they would inflict the punishment of death on the said Charles Lacy. This Ned Ludd, or General Ludd, caused considerable anxiety among the higher classes, though historians agree today that no such single person existed. On November 26, the Lord Lieutenant claimed that the disturbances are entirely gotten under, but even sympathized that the rioters are very much to be pitied and should be relieved somehow. His words, however, were premature. Hundreds of frames were destroyed that month, mostly in Nottinghamshire. In February 1812, he reported that he had to use the volunteer yeomanry cavalry as the riots became more serious. George Coldham, town clerk of Nottingham and secretary of the Hosiers Association, wrote the Home Office that 800 frames and £8,000 in value had been destroyed, and that this system must be kept down by force if we can expect the restoration of public tranquility. The Lord Lieutenant suggested in December that foreign agency is strongly suspected in the riots. A letter sent later from the Luddites claimed that we hope for assistance from the French Emperor in shaking off the yoke of the rottenest, wickedest, and most tyrannous government that ever existed. The Leeds Mercury reported that the rebellion had no parallel in history. 2,000 soldiers were dispatched to the Midlands. On January 19th, a woolen mill near Leeds in Yorkshire burned down. Arson was suspected. The Yorkshiremen were different from the Midland weavers. They were shearers who used large metal shears to make an even surface on wool. Much better paid, they were protesting new machines which automatically sheared wool, making their whole job redundant. In the Midlands, the climax of destruction was in January 1812, and in 4 days, at the end of the month, more than 100 frames were destroyed. When thefts accompanied one of the frame-breaking episodes, a Luddite article denounced them, with General Ludd claiming that they had hanged one of the men for the robbery. On February 5th, the Lord Lieutenant of Nottinghamshire wrote that Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, and Leicestershire are in a state of insurrection. Many, such as poet Robert Southey, thought that revolution is inevitable. Despite large numbers of troops, the gangs easily avoided capture, traveling disguised and at night. During 1812, some 19,000 troops were deployed in the region, on par with the initial number set with Wellington in the Peninsular War. Fighting General Ludd was becoming as much a threat as fighting Napoleon. A Luddite chant of the period went, "Chant no more your old rhymes about old Robin Hood. His feats I but little admire. I will sing the achievements of General Ludd, now the hero of Nottinghamshire." The protests also spread to Lancashire cotton weavers, and there were rumors that there were meetings between Luddites in the south and disgruntled workers in Lancashire. In response, in 1812, the government made machine breaking a capital offense. The bill criminalized persons destroying or injuring any stocking or lace frames, but did not mention the wool gigs mills destroyed in Yorkshire. Lord Byron spoke against the bill, saying he'd seen suppressed provinces in Turkey, but never under the most despotic of infidel governments did I behold such squalid wretchedness as I've seen since my return. The bill passed anyway. It was already a capital crime to send threatening letters and to go about in disguise. The Luddites' response, and perhaps best summed up in a new rhyme: "You might as well be hung for death as breaking a machine. So now, my lad, your sword unsheath, and make it sharp and keen." In Yorkshire, a similar ditty was sung. "Come, cropper lads of high renown, who love to drink good ale that's brown, and strike each haughty tyrant down with hatchet, pike, and gun." Bills to regulate wages and goods quality, while presented, continued to fail. On March 14th, a large crowd assembled in Stockport, raiding provisions and then attacking several homes and factories. At Edgeley, they broke into John Goodair's mill and home. They set the house aflame. The military arrived and read the Riot Act. A 1715 law required that officials issue a formal command, ordering them to disperse or face arrest. When they refused, the cavalry charged and the infantry advanced with bayonets. The leaders were 2 men dressed in women's clothing, referred to as General Ludd's wives. On April 11th, a large crowd approached the 4-story building of Rawford's Mill near Dewsbury. The mill was already prepared for defense by its owner, William Cartwright. An alarm bell was installed on the roof. Armed soldiers were stationed, and vicious rollers with metal spikes were positioned on the stairs, along with supplies of acid. At least 100 Luddites gathered at a stone obelisk called the Dumb Steeple before marching on the mill. That night, 5 soldiers and a dozen employees were on guard. About a half hour before midnight, Cartwright himself went to bed, only for shots to be heard. Before they could even get dressed, windows were smashed and muskets fired into the mill. One of the men attempted to ring the warning bell, only for the rope to break. The defenders returned fire. The bell was successfully rang, and from the roof, rocks tossed over to force the Luddites back. Firing from the dark, the defenders zeroed in on their foes. The Luddites withdrew, leaving 2 badly injured men behind. Both died of their wounds before the end of the next day. The recorder at Leeds saw the attack as short-sighted, writing that these deluded men are most grossly deceived if they imagine their efforts to put down machinery can ultimately succeed. The death of the Luddites provoked riots all across the north. Large crowds appeared at the men's funerals. Thomas Garside, a Lancashire manufacturer, told the Home Secretary that the uprising was the most desperate and best organized conspiracy that the world has ever witnessed. Cartwright was injured in the attack, purportedly on his own spiked rollers, but still nearly faced bankruptcy. A good sum was raised by fellow millers for his successful stand against a lawless and bloodthirsty banditti. Notices appeared on doors demanding vengeance for the blood of the innocent. Several men attempted to kill Cartwright on April 18th as he rode through the Bradley Wood. Another mill owner, William Horsfall, was successfully murdered on April 28th. A captured Luddite, Joseph Barrowclaw, arrested for the atrocious crime of twisting in, meaning to administer illegal oaths, apparently punishable by death any traitor, among the Luddites, turned informer, telling the authorities that the marriage feast of Mrs. Ludd, code for the Revolution, would take place on July 24, 1814. His intelligence amounted to little, however. More usefully, a cloth dresser named Benjamin Walker, arrested on suspicion of involvement in the Rawfords Mill attack, turned on his compatriots later in the year and fingered 3 other men in the murder of Horsfall. Riots occurred elsewhere as well. On April 20th, a large crowd carrying an effigy of the renowned General Ludd set fire to a house in Middleton. The crowd was dispersed by the military and 5 rioters killed. Another mill with 170 steam looms near Bolton was set aflame 4 days later. A bill was introduced in May to make administering illegal oaths punishable by death, which passed in July. On May 11th, the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was murdered. He had earlier been sent a threat by the Luddites. Though the assassin, John Bellingham, claimed the murder was due to a private injury and was unaffiliated with the Luddites, Luddites celebrated the killing anyway. Threats from supposed Luddites appeared all over, and the fears of imminent revolution approached hysteria. In June, the Freeman's Journal and Daily Commercial Advertiser reported that the government was seizing arms to prevent them from falling into Luddite arms, and that upwards of 2,000 Luddites were observed under discipline about 6 miles from Stockton. General Grey in Yorkshire told the Home Secretary that the whole British Army couldn't put the rebellion down. Percival's death led to a new Prime Minister, Robert Banks Jenkinson, Lord Liverpool. The government came down hard on the Luddites. That summer, more than 100 people were charged for various crimes during the disturbances. 58 were charged at Lancaster, where 28 were convicted and 8 were hanged, including a 16-year-old Abraham Charleston and a 54-year-old woman convicted of stealing potatoes. Another 15 were sentenced to death at Chester, though only 2 of the sentences were actually carried out. Rather few of the convicted were machine breakers, and many weren't even textile workers. Lieutenant General Thomas Maitland replaced the timid General Grey in June. Maitland emphasized spies, infiltrating groups and tricking them into administering oaths. Maitland, however, didn't think the problem was revolutionary, but more practical. Weavers' wages had fallen by 2/3, and food had only become more expensive. The large troop presence was still unable to prevent armed bands of Luddites. The soldiers adopted new tactics, moving in small groups and without advance notice. By the summer, machine breaking had actually declined, but picked back up in Nottinghamshire at the end of the year. 10 frames were destroyed on New Year's Day, 1813. Throughout the fall, smaller attacks occurred in Yorkshire. Lord Fitzwilliam urged further convictions of those imprisoned, afraid that it was the only way to prevent the evils of further Ludd outbreaks during the dark winter nights. The Leeds Mercury reported a resurgence, writing that the spirit of Luddism, which was thought to be extinct, has again appeared, although it was robbery and not machine breaking. Even before trial, the 3 Luddites accused of killing Horsfall, George Mellor, William Thorpe, and Thomas Smith, seemed to be doomed. Conversation among officials concerned how to avoid supporters parading their bodies. They suggested consigning the bodies to the infirmary at Leeds for dissection. The leading council declared that all of those accused, whether Luddites or not, could not be ignorant of the disturbances and therefore would be charged as being part of the gang. The trial of the three accused murderers was sensational. The court was packed, and all three pleaded not guilty. Benjamin Walker was the prosecution's star witness. He claimed to have heard Miller say that machine breaking had to be given up for murder, and that Miller had asked him personally to go with him and shoot Mr. Horsfall. Walker claimed he and Smith had been forced along and had not fired their pistols, only Miller and Thorpe had fired. The defense was that all three men had alibis, but all three were pronounced guilty. They were sentenced to death, their bodies to be dissected and animatized, and hanging 2 days later. The following day, the trial for 14 accused of the attack on Rawford's Mill began. 5 were sentenced to death. 6 others were convicted of machine breaking or burglary and sentenced to death. Altogether, 17 were hanged, including Horsfall's murderers. The 14 others were hanged on January 16, 1813, behind York Castle, the largest number ever hanged there on a single day. Only 8 were involved in the textile industry. The trials turned the populace against the authorities further. The Treasury solicitor sent orders on January 22nd not to track down the Luddites as zealously. Machine breaking essentially ended in Yorkshire. Maitland declared that the spirit of Luddism is completely extinguished. In the Midlands, machine breaking continued intermittently to 1816. Most of the troops were pulled out by the end of 1813. Multiple writers had tried, during the rebellion, to argue that machinery was a good thing and that destroying it would destroy English industry and depress wages further. One argued that weavers should be happy, as 4 times your number are employed since the invention of machinery. And why? Because your little children, by the help of machinery, can earn their own livelihood. Hardly a consolation when families were still starving. The problems of poverty remained into 1816, even after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Reverend Robert Hall in Leicester preached that the poor stockingers wrote of the emaciated forms and dejected looks, the industrious mechanic. The final major machine-breaking attack took place on June 29, 1816, against the factory of Heathcote and Lacey at Loughborough. The owners had cut wages to reduce prices. The Nottingham Review reported the outrage of the frame breakers, which very far exceeds anything of the kind that had ever before happened. All 55 of the frames there were destroyed. Ultimately, 7 people were hanged for the attack, and 3 more transported.
The Luddite rebellion has long been a matter of scholarly debate, especially regarding their motivations. Were the Midland weavers really in touch with the Yorkshire croppers? Were they as organized as the government feared? And perhaps most importantly, were they primarily a political movement that was bent on revolution? Certainly some Luddite writers talked about revolution, but it's really unclear how connected those writers were with the actual Luddite leadership. Kevin Binfield, who edited the collection The Writing of the Luddites, argues that whatever their motivation, it wasn't technology that made them angry. It was unscrupulous businessmen who were threatening their very lives by driving down prices. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. He fell asleep.